Hello, and thank you for joining us for another mental well-being class. My name is Dr. James Johnson, and I am so grateful you've chosen to spend time with us today. And if you have not been with us for a mental well-being class before, the goal is to take all of the tools and skills that you've learned here at Honey Lake Clinic and work on putting them together into practical life application so that when you leave and reintegrate back into your home life, that you know what tools to use when in order to stay on the path of wellness that God has for each of us. Now, when I was a kid, my brother and I were country rural kids, and it was a very common occurrence either after school and the homework was done or on the weekends for us to leave the house and go out into the farm and the fields and just play. And after watching the movie Mary Poppins, and that was a very popular film in my childhood, that we had this idea that we could see if you really could take an umbrella and fly. And so we decided we would take one of our mom's umbrellas, climb up on top of one of the buildings on our farm, and jump off with the umbrella and see if we could fly. Now, of course, there's something in the way of that process because in the movie, Mary Poppins had magic. But in real life, we have something called the law of gravity. And as you can imagine, being the older brother, my brother made me go first to see if it actually worked. And I opened the umbrella, jumped off the edge of the building, and the law of gravity took effect, and I fell onto the ground. And as I look back on that all these years later, I learned that if you try to go against the natural laws that God has created, that you bring punishment on yourself, whatever that attempt is, whether that's me and my brother trying to break the law of gravity, whether it is us trying to go against things like the law of entropy or the third law of thermodynamics, which says that things go from order to disorder, right? Once you have children, you know once you clean the house, if the children go out into the home, they're going to take it from order to disorder. That's just how the universe works. Well, if that is how God has created things to work in the physical world, it makes sense that God would also make other laws besides scientific laws in the physical world. There are also laws that govern the mental world. For example, if you were to have a discussion with somebody, you would need to be careful of the law of the excluded middle. It says a logical fallacy. So, for example, if I were to say, an elephant has ears, my brother has ears, therefore my brother is an elephant. That's a formal fallacy of logic, and that breaks the law of the excluded middle. If I take out those very important things in the middle in order to make a conclusion, I'm going to form a false conclusion. Because yes, an ear is present with both an elephant and my brother, but that obviously there are far more differences that separate a human being from an elephant. So there are laws of logic. But did you also know there are spiritual laws? That God has made different laws to govern our spiritual lives. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is God's design laws and how they impact our mind, how they impact our mental well-being, how you and I can learn to be in harmony, not just with the laws of physics and nature, the laws of logic and our mental processes, but also in harmony with God's spiritual laws. And what you'll see is that most of them overlap with each other because God has created a physical world and a spiritual world that overlap with each other. Now, if you are interested in going more deeply into these, I highly recommend Dr. Tim Jennings' book, Could It Be This Simple? Now, there's an actual book called Could It Be This Simple? And he also created, in partnership with Rich Kohlenberg, a workbook that has questions and answers and things like that. And you can find that on the internet. If you give a search for it, go to Come and Reason Ministries, and there's links to get access to these books. But the idea of these design laws came from this book and Dr. Tim Jennings' work. Now, Obviously, you found this video on my YouTube channel, but if you'd like a copy of these slides rather than having to write all these things down, you can access this information a couple of different ways. You can scan this QR link on the left-hand side, and it will send a request to me to give you access to my shared folder where you can download any of the PowerPoint presentations for any class I teach, whether that's these mental well-being classes, the morning reflections, Sunday sermons, pretty much any class I teach you can find there. Or you can always send me an email at jjohnson@honeylakeclinic.com and let me know you'd like a copy, and I can send you an individual copy. So let's go back to childhood. I gave you an example of something I did as a child, but think about the things that you did when you were a kid. What are the things that you did for fun? Did you go out into the yard and play? Did you have friends and neighbors? Did you live in a suburb where you could go up and down the neighborhood and hang out and play with your neighbor friends? Or did you have to go to the park, go play sports after school? What were the things you did as a child that were fun? Well, as I already mentioned, my brother and I love to go out into the woods and the farms and play, and I developed a huge love as a child for the world of science. And obviously this is not a picture of my brother and I, because one of them's a girl, and these are also babies, but I thought it was a cute picture of kids playing out in nature and examining things. And this is kind of how I felt. I felt like a detective going out into the world and trying to figure out why things operated the way they did. What was it about a caterpillar that allowed it to create a chrysalis? And if it spent enough time in that chrysalis and worked its way out the way God designed it to turn into a butterfly? Or how did leaves in the different seasons turn colors and fall off of the trees all on their own? How did different animals know the different processes to be born and walk and eat and graze and survive? All these things in the world gave me a love of learning. But as time went on, as happens with many students, I was in education for 17 years as a classroom teacher and a school administrator, and I witnessed firsthand the same thing that happened to me happened to other students in our American school system. There are many wonderful things and many amazing teachers and staff members that work in our public school system, regardless of what educational option you choose: private, public, charter, magnet, homeschool, everything in between. But in the system, there is something about putting these standards on learning that stifles a child's creativity. And that's exactly what happened to me. As I got up in the grades around the middle school years, the grade school years, up into the secondary high school years, I lost that childhood love of learning. And as I got into the upper grades and I started taking those same science classes that I used to think showed me the reality of God and the natural world, created a problem internally, and I had a crisis of faith. I had all of these questions that were being presented to me in my science classes. I was being taught things like Darwinian evolution instead of intelligent design, because in public school, thanks to the Scopes trials of the 1920s, it is illegal to teach intelligent design as an option for where everything came from in public schools. It's believed to be a contention between the separation of church and state. It's imposing religious beliefs on students. And so as I became a high school student in secondary school, and then of course into post-secondary education in my college courses, I started having all of these questions that even though I grew up in church and even though I had great mentors that taught me the things of the Christian faith, they did not give me the answers as to why science and faith were enemies. And all of my educated professors were saying things like, man, if you're a Christ follower, if you're a Christian, if you believe in religion to answer these questions, you're foolish. It's stupid to think that science is not as better than faith, that faith could answer these questions. Because after all, I mean, wasn't it primitive people that used religion to believe that the reason why volcanoes erupted is that there's a spirit or a god inside of the mountain that's angry, and you have to offer it a sacrifice to keep it from erupting to appease that god? Or the Greco-Roman mindset of the reason why the sun rising in the east and setting in the west is because there's a god who hitches his chariot to the sun and drags the sun across the sky every day. That's why the sun rises and sets. That religion was seen as foolishness. and science as pure truth. And I had a crisis of faith. And I went on a journey. I just wanted to find truth. If that caused me to be an atheist, an agnostic, a deist, a Hindu, a Buddhist, a Taoist, a whatever ist you can come up with in the religious world, I just wanted truth. And I did not realize it, but on my quest for truth, I was trying to answer the 4 major questions of life, and we call these the ontological questions. Ontology is the study of meaning and purpose. And so every single person, whether they do it on accident or on purpose, has to answer these 4 major questions about life: origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. That these are the 4 ontological questions. Origin asks the question, where did everything come from? Are we here purely by chance? Is life just here by random happenstance? Or is there a creator, an intelligent designer that put these things together? Meaning, what's the purpose of my life? Am I here on accident and my life is ultimately meaningless other than what I can assign to my life? Or was I created on purpose, with purpose, for purpose? Morality, who determines right and wrong? Well, if we're here purely by chance, morality is determined by social structures, such as the family, or culture, or even government. But if there is a creator, an intelligent designer, then that creator gets to determine right and wrong. And then finally, destiny, what happens when we die? Well, if Darwinian evolution is true, and we're here purely by chance, and there is nothing to this life other than randomness and accidental existence, then when we die, we go into the ground and life ends. But if the spiritual world exists, if there is a creator who put us a mind-body-spirit combo as the Bible teaches, then there is something after this life. And we have to figure that out, because that matters. You see, if Darwinian evolution is true and we're here purely by chance, then that leads me one direction. But if the Bible is true and Christianity is correct, then that leads me in a different direction. The way we answer these 4 questions determines whether we live as an Adolf Hitler or a Mother Teresa or somewhere in between. And as I went on this journey and I had this crisis of faith, it was a terrible time and a wonderful time, because I began to look objectively at the information for the first time. And the reason why this matters, as Dr. Jennings says, is you and I have power over what we believe. We get to examine the evidence and decide what our beliefs are based on that. But once we believe it, it then has power over us. And as I began to look at the world around me, and I looked at the information, I started to recognize, wow, there are answers to these questions, and they led me down a path of understanding and belief. So let's look at this together. Let's look at this as an example. Let's pretend that you are driving down the interstate and you're, in traffic and going through the city, maybe it's crowded and you're driving through, I don't know, let's say you're taking I-75 through Atlanta. And you start messing with your phone to answer a text message or to change the song that's playing on the radio. You drift into the other lane, you overcorrect, roll your car, and you create a massive pileup. That would be a very scary situation, especially if the other drivers in the cars were hurt as well. Well, as you go through the process, you go to the hospital and you get treated, you have experienced a traumatic event. Now, a trauma happens anytime something is experienced in our life that is so far out of the normal that our mind has trouble making sense of it. Now, in a healthy situation, this is how the process would work. In a healthy healing situation from trauma, this is how it would work. First, the traumatic event would happen. And then, in the midst of that traumatic event happening, we would experience one of these 4 reactions to that fear. Because, after all, we might die. As the car is rolling, we might be, living our last moments. And in the middle of that fear, one of 4 things might happen. We might fight back and try to, recover, control of the car again, or try to stabilize ourselves. Maybe we would want to run away. Of course, in that situation, we're stuck to the momentum of the car rolling, but flight is another response to fear. So you want to run away and get away from it. or freeze. If a bear comes into our campsite and is coming to, possibly hurt us, that we might freeze, and maybe the bear, because we're not moving, doesn't see us and it wanders off and we are saved from being attacked by the bear. Or we feign. We go along with the group. And this happens numerous times to people who are being physically hurt, physically traumatized. Or if they're in a group situation where they're afraid they might get in trouble or get hurt by the group, they go along to get along. That's called feigning. And so in this situation, right, in fear, you are trying to change the radio station, you realize you've drifted in the other lane, you try to fight back against it, and you overcorrect, and that's what causes the car to flip. And now, every time you go to get into the car to drive, now that you've healed up and you're getting ready to go back to work and school and life, you're scared. And fear overwhelms you. And you just cannot drive the car. You freeze up. Fear has overwhelmed you. You just can't do it. And maybe you have to catch the bus. Maybe you have to ask somebody to give you a ride. Maybe you have to walk or take an Uber or a taxi. But eventually, reason begins to enter the situation. And you begin to think about, I've been driving for a long time. I started driving when I was 15 with my learner's permit. I'm 42 years old now. I've been driving for 17 years. And in those 17 years of driving, I've had a few minor accidents, but the vast majority of the time, I've gotten there safely. Oh wow, I can count on one hand the number of major accidents I've had. But I can not possibly fathom the number of times I've gotten there safely. And reason enters the situation. I realize, well, I'm statistically far more likely to be safe than I am to get into another wreck. That fear of driving that's overwhelming is actually unfounded. And as I sleep at night and my brain enters REM sleep, I begin to process it even further, and my memories get processed by my brain, and they get assigned to short-term memory, long-term memory, or discarded as unneeded to make room for other things. And the fluids that wash through our neural pathways assign these memories where they go, and they flush out all those things. And then, over time, I begin to process it. And I say, wow, okay, I just need to be more careful. I need to learn not to mess with my phone when I'm driving, that if it's a song I don't want to listen to, it's safer to listen to a song I don't like than to mess with my phone or the radio while I'm driving and could possibly get into another wreck. And then balance is restored and I move on with my life. That's healthy. Now, things like post-traumatic stress disorder ends up developing when our brain can't go through this process. But the goal is to work through this equation. And this equation is that feelings must be balanced with reality to lead us to truth. That if you and I want to find truth, our feelings must be balanced with reality. And anytime our feelings get the best of us and we can't balance that with reality, we're not going to find truth. For example, if I'm a child and at night, whenever it's dark in my room, the shadows that are playing across my wall make me think that there are monsters crawling around on the floor, moving underneath my bed, and I'm scared. Well, at that point, if I'm not bringing reality into the situation, I'll never get to the truth. Because what is the truth? Well, I have to bring reality into the situation. What if I turn on the light and I see it for what it really is? And there's no monster on the floor. It's just the shadows moving around because of the light moving back and forth through my window. No problem. What's the truth? There are no monsters. But until I bring that reality into the situation by turning on a light, I'll never get to the truth, and I'll always be ruled by my feelings. See how that works? Why does this work this way? Well, your brain has many, many parts to it, but three important parts for this discussion are the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. The prefrontal cortex is where we make critical thinking decisions, where reason enters into our mind. The amygdala is our emotional center. This is where we feel our feelings. And of course, the hippocampus is where our memories are stored. Now, the way this may operate is, let's say that one night I get up and I go to use the bathroom, and I'm not thinking much of it. But as I get up to walk across the room, it's a stormy night, and lightning flashes, and the thunder claps, and I get scared, and I see all the lights moving, the shadows around my room, and I'm freaked out. And I jump back in the bed, and I say, I can't get out of bed. There's monsters on the floor. That's what the shadows are from. Well, that critical thinking that should be entering into the process is cut off because that fear from the storm, the lightning, the thunder, and that belief about the shadows moving around the wall are all brought on by my amygdala. See, when our amygdala is inflamed with intense emotions, it cuts off access to our prefrontal cortex. And so then I form a belief, not based on reason, but based off emotion, because that prefrontal cortex is not being accessed. And I believe that at night, when I crawl in my bed and everyone goes to sleep, the monsters come out from under my bed and crawl around the floor at night. And so now every time I go to bed at night and it gets dark in the house, my hippocampus brings up that memory of that storm, and that fear is reignited. And every time my amygdala gets inflamed, my prefrontal cortex cannot be accessed. You see, and this puts me in a dangerous loop. And while this is a child's story, there are many things that may happen in our life. You see, if I never bring reason, reality into the equation, I'm never going to find truth. I'm going to constantly live my life as if there are monsters crawling on the floor at night and I can't get out of bed once everyone goes to sleep in my house and all the lights are turned off. And then I won't ever drive that car because that feeling of fear, what if I get into another wreck? What if I hurt people again? Oh, I can never drive again because I'm just too scared. I've lost my ability to drive forever. Is that true? No, I'm being led by my emotions and I have no balance. And you see, this matters. We have to allow ourselves to emotionally regulate our feelings so that we can bring reality into the situation. When my amygdala gets inflamed based off these life situations, then my emotional volume is high and my critical thinking volume is low. I have to bring balance to both of them. I have to regulate my emotions so that my critical thinking can come up and I can find the balance between feelings and reality to lead me to the truth. The same truth that allowed me to drive the car again, the same truth that allowed me to turn on the light, realize there are no monsters in the house. I can get up and use the bathroom anytime I want to without fear. Why does this matter? Well, in the grand scheme of life, life is more than car wrecks and childhood imaginations. We have a spiritual component to our life. Now, this is greater than just religion. Religion is the practice of our spiritual beliefs, but the deeper level of our spirituality is our connection to meaning and purpose. Now, I'm a Christ follower. I'm a Christian. I believe the teachings of the Christian faith. But I came to that conclusion over time of examining the evidence. And the studies show us that people who have a solid spiritual religious foundation, they are much more capable of dealing with trauma, overwhelming stress, and they can experience something called post-traumatic growth. They can go through these traumatic events, and because of their spiritual resiliency, they can grow from them. They can have deeper appreciation for life, and they can learn how to operate life in a meaningful way. And so why are we talking about this? Why am I telling you this? Because I want you to know what you believe and why you believe it about life, regardless of whatever that belief is. Of course I want you to believe what I believe. But my faith and my beliefs can't change your life. You have to come to your own. You have to answer those 4 questions we talked about for yourself. And so let's go back to my early 20s and late teens when I had that crisis of faith. What I realized during that time is that scientists are good detectives. And as I went on this journey to understand the world, and I began to look at it with fresh eyes, with objective understanding, to say, I want to see this for what it really is and to discover truth by balancing my feelings with reality. To discover truth, I want to have a belief system based off of reality, to have a reasonable belief system, a worldview that actually lines up with the real world. And so I became in love with science again, and I realized that scientists are good detectives. You see, I also love a good mystery. Sherlock Holmes, right? Hercule Poirot, the great detectives of the world. And as we look at the world around us, what we have to understand is that scientists are good detectives. They look at the evidence and they come to logical conclusions. And now what we may call a guess or a hunch in the detective world, we call a hypothesis in the scientific world. We see something at work in the world and the natural, and we say, I think this is why it happens. And then we test it. And as we test it and it proves itself reliable, it becomes a theory. And when it is tested over time and reproducible all the time, it goes from being a hypothesis to a theory, and from a theory to a law, like the law of gravity or laws of entropy, laws of thermodynamics. So as I began to look at the world and make observations as a good detective, as a good scientist, I made some observations. Observation one, I realized that the world and the universe is full of systems. That there are systems that work together to make the world operate. And so this is first observation I recognize, is that there are systems in the world. Here's an example of one of those systems. It's called the water cycle. And as the system operates, clouds collect water. We call that condensation. And when they get too full of moisture, that moisture collects until it gets too heavy, and then it falls to the ground in precipitation. We also call that rain. And as it rains, or snows or sleets or hails, and that water makes its way back to the ground, it goes through a collection. And it may end up in lakes, rivers, and streams, and that make their way back to the ocean, or it may go underground into groundwater, like aquifers and things like that, springs. And as the surface water is exposed to the sunshine, the heat from the sun causes evaporation, which brings the water back up into the sky again, because hot air rises, hot goes up, cold comes down. So as the moisture is evaporated in the sun, it goes up into the atmosphere again, where it's collected into the clouds. And this is the water cycle. And everything is nourished through this cycle. And this spawns other cycles, where water nourishes the ground, which causes grass to grow, plants and turn it into food for animals and humans, and of course animals become nourishment for humans. And this creates a cycle, and then plants, animals, and human beings eventually die. Their bodies decompose and nourish the soil, so that when the water comes around again, it can create a separate cycle. The water cycle produces a life cycle. And so the world and the universe, all of the creation, is full of systems. And so as we look at these systems, we recognize that every small part is connected to a larger system. The water cycle is connected to the life cycle, and the life cycle is connected to things like a food chain, right? And inside of the human body, there are systems, such as the circulatory system, or the respiratory system, the lymphatic system. All of these systems work together in the same way all the systems inside my body work to make me a living human being. My life as a human being is dependent on outside cycles, like the water cycle. As a farmer growing up, farming, our family learned about the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle in soil, that you can deplete soil of those natural nutrients, and you have to replenish them, so that plants can grow and our crops could be healthier. You see, as we look at these interconnected systems, we recognize they are required for life to exist and be sustained. And in the scientific world, we call these anthropic principles. For example, if we were any closer to the sun, we would burn up. Any further away, we would freeze to death. We are the perfect distance from the sun for life to exist. Or gravity. Gravity any higher as a constant, and the entire world would change, and so many things would not be able to exist the way they do. If gravity was decreased, things would change, and we would be floating around. We wouldn't be able to be held to the planet without gravity. See, all these systems work together, and they create life as it is. I heard a professor say one time, and this is, I realize, an approximation, but he said that the probability of all the required anthropic principles to exist on Earth, to create life the way we have it here, is like firing a bullet blindfolded, being spun around at 300 miles an hour on a merry-go-round, firing a second bullet blindfolded, and hitting that original bullet head-on, bullseye. That's how mathematically improbable it is for all of these systems to work together, and yet we find them here. But not only do we find the systems working together, these systems have purpose. I mean, think about the system of your senses in your body. You have different systems that provide sight, smell, taste, hearing, and touch. You can use your five senses to live life, but each one of them is connected to a different system in your body. The nervous system, right? You've got a digestive system, you've got an auditory system, right? You've got all the millions and millions of neurons that are connected from your eye, your retina, to your brain to give you sight, to absorb light photons. I mean, all these things work together so that we can live life the way we do. Now, if you eliminated any of these senses, a person could still have life, but not the way that we have now. And so each of these things, I mean, think about your sense of taste. That there are certain tastes that are meant to show you what things are good to eat and what things are not. Bitterness is a sense that we have that helps us find that just because something's bitter doesn't mean it's poisonous, but that's one of the signs that when something is sweet or savory, that means that they're rich in calories and help us survive. That's why we have an attraction to certain flavors. Our hearing allows us to communicate with each other and understand sounds. You see, all of these things work together and have purpose. That as we look around the world, we see that these systems are interconnected and provide a purpose. Isn't it interesting how we as human beings breathe in oxygen, process it, and in the respiratory system of our bodies put out, we exhale carbon dioxide. And it's amazing that the plants on this planet take in carbon dioxide and give off oxygen. That this is an amazing system that if it didn't operate, we wouldn't be able to live. And so these individual systems have a purpose that cause life to happen. And the more we learn on the molecular level and the genetic level, all of these things on the microscopic level are interconnected. I mean, even now that we're learning about things like string theory and quantum mechanics, all of these things are showing us the purpose behind the things that we still don't understand exactly how they work. But the more we learn, the more we realize all these things are interconnected with design, systems, and purpose. And that was the third thing that we recognized, that there's systems, purpose, and as I mentioned, design. This is a silly picture, but imagine we were walking through the woods and we see a smartphone sitting in a puddle by the trail. What if I were to say, wow, look, I have found a smartphone in its original environment. Now I know where they collect smartphones from in nature in order to sell them in stores. You'd probably chuckle thinking I was joking, because I couldn't possibly be serious. Why? Because smartphones don't naturally come together out in the wild. There's not a place where people go and collect and harvest smartphones in nature the way we might collect fish or harvest a crop or collect apples off of an apple orchard. Smartphones aren't found randomly in nature. They are too complicated. They're too complex. They have too many interconnected systems and programming for it to be here purely by chance. Do you realize that as fascinating and as incredibly complex as our smartphones may be, your human body is far more complex? That the eye, just your eye, is far more advanced than any technological system we have created so far. Now, we've got some amazing stuff, but nothing comes close to the eye or the brain. You are an amazing collection of systems that are working together in design. And the same way nobody would look at that smartphone in that puddle and say, wow, this came together purely by chance. It's logical to recognize that if there is design, if there's cohesion, if there's interconnectedness, that logically follows there must be a designer. And that's when I began to put these puzzle pieces together. I started with observation number 1, systems. Observation number 2, purpose. Observation number 3, design. I began to come back to a recognition that there may be evidence for God. Maybe what I was learning in my upper level, secondary, and college level courses, post-secondary courses, were actually wrong. That there's more evidence pointing towards intelligent design than away from it. And as we look at these systems, we recognize that this wouldn't happen purely by chance. Over billions and billions of years, time plus matter plus chance could not work together, because One of the laws of science, the law of conservation of mass and energy, tells us that matter can't be created or destroyed. So if it can't be created, but there was a point where it didn't exist, that means that something is powerful enough to exist outside of the laws of science to create the laws of science. And that thing must be powerful enough and intelligent enough to create matter in such a way that not only would it exist, but it would work together over time to create everything we see here. It's logical to conclude that if there is design in this world, in this universe, there must be a designer. But it doesn't stop there. You see, we're moving past just the smartphone argument, because we also recognize there's morality. This is one of my favorite movies, The Emperor's New Groove. And in that movie, this guy that's in this picture, Kronk, is having to make decisions. And we, for a long time, have used this imagery of an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other. One drawing us to do the morally right thing, and one drawing us to do the evil, selfish things. And in this particular decision, he's trying to decide whether he should allow another character to fall off a cliff and die. And the angel and the demon are trying to, the devil are trying to tempt him to make a wise decision or a selfish decision. And this decision-making process, we call this moral reasoning. And while we may not literally have an angel or a devil on our shoulder, we do have a wrestling against what we know is morally right and what is selfish. And I'll give you an example. My daughter, a couple of Thanksgivings ago, we like to go Black Friday shopping, and we don't go the way we used to when we were younger and before technology and online shopping and things like that kind of changed things. When you used to have to wait overnight or get up super early to get in the lines to get the best Black Friday deals. But we like to go, and we like to go early, and we try to catch some of the deals that are still out there. And as we were walking through a dark parking lot, our oldest daughter, at the time she was 13 years old, and she said, "Daddy, look." And she had folded up $100 bills, $200. And she said, "What do you think I should do?" And I said, "Baby, what do you think you should do?" And I'm not the best parent. I've made tons of failures and mistakes in my parenting over the years, but that was one of my good moments where instead of giving her the answer, I let her make the decision. But it was a moral dilemma. She had to decide whether to do the selfish thing and to keep the money, or to do the morally right thing to do based off of the Christian ethic, because we're a Christian family, that she recognized that's not her money. That's somebody else's money. And she looked at me and she said, "Daddy, what if this is somebody's Christmas money for their children or their family, and they lost it?" I said, "Well, what do you think? What if it is?" She said, "I wouldn't want to lose our Christmas money and have somebody not give it back to us. Let's go see." And we turned it in. And I don't know if the store manager kept it or put it in their pocket or if somebody ever found it. But that was a moral decision. And the existence of morality flies in the face of Darwinian evolution, because Darwinian evolution is survival of the fittest. And what we recognize is that as we go through the study of history and anthropology and sociology, is that society has created laws based off moral precepts, and throughout history, many of those laws are common. The idea of not stealing, not murdering, not killing somebody needlessly, right? Not lying and deceiving somebody. That's a commonality. You see, if we're going based off of, sheer survival of the fittest, then it would make the most sense for me as a male of my species to have as many children as possible. And so what should that mean? That means I should be have as many sexual partners as possible to spread, the possibility of having more children, more progeny, more offspring, so that I can have more, success in life, and I can spread my dominant genetics throughout the world. But how would that work in my marriage? If my wife were to find out that I was having sex with all these different women besides her, what if I were to go to her and say, "See, you can't be upset at that. I'm just doing what's best for the species, so that the better genetics can make its way through the world." But she'd be hurt by that. understandably, rightfully so. That's a moral system, that her belief that we have pledged ourselves to each other as spouses, and I should not go against our relationship in the name of survival of the fittest. You see, these things are in contradiction with each other. Why? Because there's morality. And every society throughout history that we know of, I can't say that every single one, because there's maybe societies we don't know about, but every one we know of has a system of morality. And what we recognize is that there are intrinsic moral compasses that we all have that don't have to be taught. You don't have to be taught by society. Now, some things, sure, like the way we dress, the language we use. My oldest daughter, the one that found the money, she likes to ask me from time to time, Daddy, who makes the rules over which words are good and which ones are bad? That's a good question. Society makes that determination. We decide this is a okay word and this is profanity, this is a bad word, a curse word. But that's just one example. But greater than that, there are moral laws that we all have to deal with. I'll give you an example. When I was stationed in Germany with the Army, I got the chance to go to Nuremberg. And while in Nuremberg, Germany, I got to go to where the Nuremberg war trials were held after World War II, where the Nazi leaders that were still alive that got caught were put on trial for war crimes. And as they were being tried, their lawyer had a very intelligent and very crafty defense strategy. Their lawyer came in front of the judges and they said, Your Honors, what was done by my clients was legal, and you have no right to come and say what their nation's laws were wrong. You don't have the right to do that. And guess what? The lawyer was right. That's called doctrine of state. It's part of the national conventions that we have between nations, that the United States doesn't just waltz into Mexico or Canada and impose our nation's laws on another nation. It's called doctrine of state. Well, this flabbergasted the judges. They didn't have a comeback. So they called a recess to consider that claim. Because if Darwinian evolution is true, and morality is simply a byproduct of society so that people can get along, then those judges had no right to say that what the Nazis did is the leading party of Germany. In Nazi Germany, where those leaders, the killing of millions of people, 9 million Jews and millions of other people at the hands of the Nazis in concentration camps and attempts at genocide. The 25 plus million people they killed during World War II. They can't come to them and say that what they did was wrong. They could say, I don't like it. It makes me upset. It bothers me. It makes me uncomfortable. They can't say it was wrong. And after their 2-hour recess, they came back and the head judge looked at them and they said, you are right. We don't have the ability to look at your actions and say they were wrong. But there's a judge above us, talking about God. And it's his moral laws that we use to condemn your actions and hold you accountable for them. You see, without an appeal to a divine morality given by God, even the war crimes judges could not condemn the Nazi leaders for the evil things they did. You see, there is a moral law. We cannot escape it. And if there is a moral law, there must be a moral law giver who determines it. So there's morality. But we don't stop there. There's another one. And this is causality. The law of causality shows us that things domino into the next. That if I were to go into my marriage relationship and not be faithful to my wife in the name of having more children and spreading my superior genetics throughout the world to create the best species of the best version of humanity, if that's really what I believe that my genetics was, then what would be the domino effect of that? I would have a wife that would not believe I was faithful, and she would no longer trust me. And that lack of trust would corrupt our marriage relationship and lead us to separation. I would have children from all these different women who I'm unable to parent well. and I'm not a good father to, and that would create a disjointed relationship in them, and these children would grow up without a good father, and as they grow up without a good father, they in turn would not know how to father. See, and instead of creating a causality that led to good, I actually created a causality that led to negative. You see, these domino effects happen in life, and in the natural world, we can recognize that systems impact the other systems. And the law of causality teaches us that every effect has a cause, creating life cycles. And so ultimately, as we take all these laws of causality back, there has to come back to the very beginning. That initial moment, whether you call it the Big Bang or the uncaused cause, whatever, there must be something that started all of these things. Einstein proved, and many other scientists have verified, that the universe is expanding. And if the universe is expanding, that means that it had a moment of conception where it began the process and everything exploded into reality. But that wouldn't have happened purely on its own. If there is not a cause to cause everything else, things don't happen purely on their own. And so, as I looked at these 5 things, we call these different types of arguments for God. The first one is the teleological argument, the argument from purpose. Then I looked at the universe, and I call it the cosmological argument, the argument for design, to look at all the systems and the anthropological principles. So there's cosmological argument, the universe, the teleological argument, the idea of purpose, and then the ontological argument, the idea of value and meaning, that there are things in this world that have meaning and purpose to them. And these 3 arguments are the 3 major ones. The cosmological, the teleological, and the ontological are the 3 main arguments that I use to come to this idea that there is an intelligent design behind everything, that we're not here purely by accident, that Darwinian evolution is not true, because survival of the fittest actually doesn't work in real life when you actually test it against reality. So I needed a worldview that lined up with those things, and only the Christian worldview lined up with reality and provided answers to the world as it actually exists. And then, of course, there's this thing called the resurrection of Jesus, which I have a different class on, so I encourage you to look for that class on my YouTube channel called Faith and Facts. But I could not escape from that either. And this led me back to a belief in God, and not just any God, the Christian God. And this caused me to ask some more questions, some what ifs. What if the way I had been taught God, and maybe you had been taught God, was not an accurate representation? See, I had been taught that God was a cruel judge that wanted to condemn the world, that just wanted people to step out of line so that he could punish them with force and violence and torture. But what if God's laws aren't legal codes like human beings think they are? You see, one of the great lies that I believe we fell for, great traps of belief that we fell into, is that because Christianity really became a flourishing system, an organization under the Roman Empire, the Christians began to look to Caesar as the example of what God was like, and God's laws to what the Roman Empire's legal codes were, the imperial system they lived in. And just as Caesar has to use force and violence and punishment to exact the force required to get people to follow the laws of the empire, God must as well. But what if we got that wrong? You see, 70% of people think of God in a negative way. But the studies show that the only healing that can happen in the mind when it comes to the way we think of God is when we think of God in a positive way. That's the only thing that changes our mind and our structure of our brain, because that's the only thing that lines up with reality. You see, what if God's laws were not legal codes? What if they were more like laws of science? And the same way that I bring consequences on myself by trying to break the law of gravity, when my brother and I played Mary Poppins and I jumped off the building with the umbrella and realized I could not break the law of gravity, I brought punishment on myself. Bruises. Thankfully I didn't break any bones, but I very easily could have. And I got some bad bangs and some bruises. Why? Did God do that to me? Did God reach down from heaven and give me that pain and suffering? Or did I bring it on myself by trying to break his natural law? The same thing is true with God's design laws. What if God's laws were natural systems that when I line up with them, they bring me life rather than legal codes that bring condemnation? What if God is actually a purpose giver, a cosmic designer, a moral lawmaker, and a life causer, and not a cosmic judge who wants to condemn? What if the church, even with the best of intentions, fell into the trap of thinking of God the wrong way, misunderstanding him, and therefore misrepresenting him to others? You see, science and faith don't have to be enemies. I love this quote by Pope Pius XII. He says this: "True science discovers God waiting behind every open door." The 1920s, and it's part of the Death of God movement and the response to the Great Depression and the stock market crash and all of these problems with World War I and seeing evil on a global scale, they began to make science and faith enemies. But that's not the way it has to be. The last 100 years of fighting each other has only caused more problems, when, as Pope Pius XII rightly recognized, every time we learn more about science, we discover God already there because he created it this way. And if you and I can get into alignment with God's design laws, we can actually find health and wellness, meaning and purpose in our lives. So I hope this brief testimony of my life and the observations I made about the world got your appetite whetted to these design laws of God. In our next session, we're going to begin discussing those design laws, what they are specifically, and how you and I can get into alignment with them in order to have that life of wellness that God wants. What did Jesus proclaim? He said that he had come to give us life and life to the full. One of the design laws I'll give you a sneak peek to is the law of happiness. And the law of happiness tells us we can never be truly happy until we're truly healthy. And the reason why so many people I meet in this world are unhappy is because they're unhealthy. And we're going to talk about that more. If you have questions, if you say, James, I don't understand what you're talking about, I want to dig a little deeper into these things, I want to learn more about your story, or I want to ask questions about some of these things, you can always email me at jjohnson@honeylakeclinic.com, or give me a call or send me a text message at my number listed on the screen. Thank you again for joining us for this class. I hope it has opened your mind, opened your heart, and whetted your appetite, as we already said, to continue discovering and processing and hopefully applying the design laws of God. So join us next time for our next class, where we will dig deeper into this and actually begin looking at the specific design laws. So until next time, be blessed.